You're listening to the Quint podcast.
पेपर में आया न, भारत टाइम्स में भी और टीवी में भी दिया गया कि अगर आप ये नॉनवेज की दुकानें खोलते हैं तो आप पर भारी जुर्माना करा जाएगा और दूसरा आपका जो लाइसेंस है उसको जब्त करके दोबारा लाइसेंस रिन्यू नहीं करा जाएगा। कारण यही था। तो इंसान क्या करेगा जब लाइसेंस नहीं है, वो तो तबाह हो गया।
That was Krishan Kumar, a meat seller at the INA market in South Delhi for the past 40 years. In an unprecedented move on 4th April, the mayor of South Delhi Municipal Corporation proposed to shut meat shops under his jurisdiction during the Navratri festival, which will last till 11th April. In a letter to the South Delhi Commissioner, Mayor Mukkesh Suryaan, a Bhartiya Janta Party member, argued that, quote-unquote, in view of the sentiments and feelings of the general public, necessary directions may be issued to the officers concerned to take necessary action for the closure of meat shops during the 9-day period. End quote. This sudden proposal to blanket ban meat shops led to large-scale confusion and tension in meat shops in South Delhi, for whom such a ban was a first. And it's important to note here that an official order to shut down any form of trade can only be passed by the commissioner, not the mayor, and no such order so far has materialized. So, what was the purpose of such a letter? More so, will the order of shutting down meat shops during festivals hold up in court? In today's episode, you'll hear from some of the meat shop owners the Quint spoke to in South Delhi's INA market. And for a legal analysis on this proposed ban, you'll also hear from Mukkesh Suryaan, the Quint's legal editor. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you, and I'm your host, Himmat. As the news of the mayor's letter and proposed meat ban became the topic of TV news debates on 4th April and newspaper headlines the very next day, it caused a ripple effect on the industry, especially the footfall traffic in the markets. Let's start with what meat sellers and shop owners had to say. The Quint's reporter Ishwar Gole went to these areas to uncover the impact of this letter. Nasir Ahmed, the meat seller in the INA market for the past 20 years, says that as more and more media came and showed some shops being closed, the footfall was affected. He says that he generally earns rupees 2,000 to rupees 3,000 per day, but the work has reduced since the letter came out.
कोई गाइडलाइंस नहीं है हमारे पास कि बंद होगी नहीं होगी। वेटनरी डिपार्ट हमें कुछ नहीं बताया। आज तक तो ऐसा नहीं हुआ है जो कभी बंद हुआ हो और इससे किसी को कोई तकलीफ हो। जिसे खाना होगा वो मार्केट में आएगा। ये तो ऐसे भी कवर्ड मार्केट है, ओपन तो है नहीं, बैक साइड में कवर्ड मार्केट है। जिसे खाना होगा वो आकर के लेके जाएगा। यहाँ पे तमाम एम्बेसी के लोग हैं, फॉरेनर लोग आते हैं, उनको जिनको जरूरत है वो लेके जाते हैं। ऐसा कुछ नहीं है कि यहाँ आसपास के एरिया में बहुत बड़ी मंदिर है, उनको आस्था को कुछ हो रहा है, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है। जिसे जरूरत है वो आएंगे। जैसे ये भाई लोग लेकर के जा रहे हैं, इनको जरूरत है, लेके थैले भर के जा रहे हैं। जनरल दिनों में ठीक ठाक सेल हो जाता है। ये मार्केट है तो लोग 2-3 हजार रुपए तो कमा ही लेते हैं, ऐसे नहीं है। और हर दुकान पे 5, 7, 10 लेबर वर्कर काम करते हैं। अब सब वर्कर जो है वो 2-3 दिन से इतना हो गया कि वो लोग खाली देख लो खाली घूम रहे हैं। इसका असर बहुत पड़ गया। एक तो नवरात्रे था, दूसरा जो आप मीडिया वाले ने कहा तो और असर पड़ गया है।
The Quint also spoke to Tabby Ray, a vendor at CR Park's fish market since 2005, who explained how even the wholesalers from whom he purchases his stock at Gazipur Mandi have been extremely cautious of stocking up.
हमारे मार्केट में 20 दुकान है। जैसे हमारे लेबर कम से कम इस मार्केट के 80 आदमी परिवार है। जैसे मेरे दुकान में 3 लेबर है, 3 फैमिली चल रही है। मेरे दुकान में फैमिली हमारे भी चल रहे हैं। दुकान रेंट की दुकान है, बंद रखने से तो बहुत ज्यादा दिक्कत हो जाती है। जैसे कोरोना गए, कोविड में बहुत ही ज्यादा दिक्कत हो, हम उठे अचानक से बंद कर देंगे तो ये भी बड़ा दिक्कत है। जैसे हमारे बैलेंस के माल होती है, जैसे कल हमने परसों फिश लाया था, कल तो ट्यूसडे तक कोई दिक्कत नहीं है। जैसे आज लाया, कल अचानक से बंद कर देगा, बहुत ज्यादा हमारे नुकसान हो जाएंगे। खबर से तो हमारा मार्केट में बहुत फर्क पड़ा। जैसे कस्टमर भी आ नहीं रहा, जैसे होलसेल में माल भी नहीं आ रहा, बेचेगा कहाँ पर? दिल्ली में आएंगे तो दिल्ली वाला अगर नहीं खरीदेगा तो दिक्कत हो जाएगी ना। कच्चा माल है, खराब होना है। गर्मी के टाइम में इधर नवरात्र है, उधर रोजा है, क्रिस्टल लोग कभी अभी 40 चल रहे हैं, तो इसको खपत करना बहुत भारी काम है। इस चक्कर में माल भी बहुत कम आ रहा है। कल से दुकानदारी भी बहुत हल्की है, रिटेल कस्टमर ही नहीं है। दो भी जानने वाले ग्राहक हैं, टेलीफोन में जो ऑनलाइन टेलीफोन करते हैं उनसे मार्केटिंग जो भी हो रहा है कर रहे हैं। तो रिटेल तो बिल्कुल ही खत्म हो गई, ना बराबर का। जैसे हमारे सुबह रिटेल हो जाते, जैसे 10 टेलीफोन में डिलीवरी होता तो 12-15 ग्राहक एक दुकानदार के ऊपर रिटेल कस्टमर ओपन होती है, वो बिल्कुल ही आज नहीं है। और ऊपर से जो भी ग्राहक आ रहे हैं उनको माल पसंद नहीं है, क्योंकि होलसेल में माल कम आ रहे हैं, माल नहीं है, वेरायटी चाहिए। हमारे जो कस्टमर होते हैं ज्यादातर बंगाली कस्टमर है, इनको वेरायटी चाहिए, 10, 15, 20 वेरायटी के। वेरायटी किसी दुकान में भी बिल्कुल ना बराबर का है।
But let's get back to the said letter here, which has prompted caution among meat sellers. What does this letter exactly say? Let's break it down. Mayor Suryaan in his letter said that quote-unquote religious beliefs and sentiments of devotees are affected when they come across meat shops or have quote-unquote have to bear the foul smell of meat on their way to offer daily prayers to goddess Durga, end quote. And later in an interview with ANI, the civic body chief said fines will also be imposed on violators and that the SDMC will issue licenses with this condition in the future. The fear of fines being imposed and licenses being snatched away led to many shops being closed on Tuesday. And this has also impacted the daily wage laborers. We spoke to Sajid, a labourer who has worked for several shops in the market for the past 15 years, who said that most of the vendors he works for are finding it more difficult to pay him on a daily basis because of the reduced footfall.
सर, एक तो कस्टमर कल आया बहुत परेशान रहा और दुकानदार भी सब डर गए। और पहले तो बात 1 तारीख को कुछ भी फैसला देना चाहिए। 3-4 नवरात्रे बीतने के बाद आप 5वें दिन आप मेयर जी बता रहे हैं और वो भी लिखित के तौर पे नहीं है। ना MCD वाला कोई आया है, ना कोई प्रशासन कोई आया है। INA मार्केट के अंदर में यहाँ 405 लेबर काम करता है, सब मिला के 1500 लेबर यहाँ काम कर रहा है। नवरात्रे हो चाहे ईद हो, जब पैसे ही नहीं होगा तो काम कैसे चलेगा? सो क्या खरीदेगा, क्या पीनेगा आदमी?
The mayor's letter also comes on the heels of a similar order being passed by Ghaziabad Mayor Asha Sharma, who later reversed the order. But let's talk some more about Mayor Suryaan's letter, because there are a few puzzling facts that he has stated that don't hold water. Pertinently, the mayor in his letter pointed out that quote-unquote 99% of people in Delhi fast and do not consume non-vegetarian food during the fasting days, end quote. However, data on the same says different. According to a 2021 survey by the Center for Studying Developing Societies, CSDS, Lokniti, and a German think tank called Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Sikhs and Hindus were the least likely to fast during festivals compared to Muslims. Data from the survey also shows that 19% of the surveyed Hindus and 63% of the surveyed Sikhs didn't fast, even when there was a festival going on. Additionally, only 32% of Hindu youngsters said that they fasted during the festivals, so we can assume that the number of fasting people is not that high in the first place. What is also peculiar about this letter is that it has happened in India's capital, which has the reputation of being called India's butter chicken capital. And Delhi's meat-eating habits also don't allow for such bans. But here is the overall data on India's food habits. According to the National Family Health Survey 5, which was conducted in 2019-2021, only about 1/3 population of women and a quarter population of men are vegetarians. And that's why the order came as a surprise to many in the INA market, especially Krishan Kumar, who has been working there for the past 40 years. He said that in all the time he has worked in the market, it hasn't closed for a single day.
नवरात्रों के दौरान इतना ज्यादा काम भी नहीं होता। अगर वो कहते हैं बंद होनी चाहिए तो उसको एक रूल बनाना चाहिए। 1 हफ्ता पहले मार्केट में नोटिस भेजें कि हाँ भाई नवरात्रों के दौरान आपकी पूरी मार्केट बंद रहेगी, तो लोग फॉलो करेंगे। अब 3 दिन बाद अचानक से बोलोगे तो ऐसा कितना लोगों का लाखों रुपए का नुकसान हुआ है। 2 दिन बंद रहने से तो मछली कितनी सड़ी, बकरा कितना सड़ा और लोगों का जो मुर्गा इतना खराब हुआ तो कहाँ जाएगा वो, कितना नुकसान हुआ। नहीं, कभी ऐसा नहीं हुआ। 40 साल, पिछले 40 सालों से मैं यहाँ पर काम कर रहा हूँ, 40 सालों में ऐसा कभी भी नहीं हुआ।
The letter, of course, invited criticism from the opposition as well. National Conference leader Omar Abdullah hit out at the SDMC mayor, tweeting that, quote-unquote, during Ramzan, we don't eat between sunrise and sunset. I suppose it's okay if we ban every non-Muslim resident or tourist from eating in public, especially in the Muslim-dominated areas. If majoritarianism is right for South Delhi, it has to be right for Jammu and Kashmir, end quote. And slamming the ban on the sale of meat in the national capital, TMC MP Mahua Moitra said that the constitution granted freedom to citizens to consume meat whenever they wanted and gave shopkeepers who sold meat the freedom to run their businesses. And MP Moitra's point of there being a constitutional right is correct, but it is also important to note here that meat bans are not a new norm, and these kind of orders have been issued before and also been upheld by courts. For example, in 2008, the Supreme Court upheld a 9-day closure of slaughterhouses on account of Paryushan, which is an important festival in Jainism. The apex court said that while this affected the fundamental right to freedom of trade and occupation, such a restriction was quote-unquote reasonable. However, the Quint's legal editor, Vakasha Sachdev, says that judgments in the past may not be applicable to the situation in South Delhi right now. He weighs in on how the mayor's letter also infringes upon the right to privacy and equality.
So when it comes to this kind of meat ban, what we have to understand is that the law on this is not entirely clear, right? There are two very clear fundamental rights which come into the equation here. One is the easy one to think of is the one which is, okay, what about the rights of people who want to eat meat, right? Like, why are you making it difficult for them to be able to access this during this time just because some other people are not okay with it? This falls within your right to privacy. It falls within your right to freedom of choice, which, even your right to freedom of expression, you could say this falls within. And a decision which prevents you from doing that without it being entirely reasonable would be a violation of your rights. So not even just the traders, like, a person who wants to eat meat could also potentially go to the courts and say, what is this? Why am I being stopped from being able to access this? Something which is an important part of my diet, or just something which I want to eat during this time. And especially given that, you have the right to privacy judgment of the Supreme Court in 2017, I think that certainly adds a new layer to this to this right, which is something which could perhaps be claimed and give you more of a basis to challenge this kind of an order as a person who eats meat. Perhaps but the thing is, it's one of these strange things where if we look at this in the past, when these kind of things have come up, the real challenges have been brought by the people who are the sellers of meat, right? And for them, it's in a sense an even more serious threat, right? Like, it's very easy for us to say, oh, it's just a few days, so what is the big deal? But for say daily wage workers or people who are working at these shops, they're not going to get paid for those 9 days. For them, that's a huge deal. It's a matter of privilege for us to be able to say that this is okay. And in fact, in this context, there is a Supreme Court judgment from around, I think it was 2008, where they were looking at the Paryushan festival in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, for which there was a request to have these shops closed down. And the court said, oh, it's just a matter of a few days, so it shouldn't matter. Now, again, maybe the meat store owner is going to be fine, but what about those daily wage workers? And that thought process just doesn't seem to have even bothered the Supreme Court, which once again speaks to a lot of how these decisions which were passed by the Supreme Court, even at a time when we weren't necessarily scrutinizing them very seriously, are very, very problematic. Now, having said that, those orders which were passed, which was passed by the Supreme Court in 2008, where it allowed this ban, or even a previous judgment from 2004, where it allowed a meat and egg ban in Rishikesh, actually shouldn't necessarily be very good precedent for the current situation, because in those cases, there was a clear acknowledgement that there were unique cultural factors behind why that was done. So if you look at the Paryushan case, it was noted that this had been something which had been happening in Ahmedabad for some time now. In fact, it had been taking place in Ahmedabad since 1993. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay. No, not necessarily. But at least, for instance, you could argue that, okay, look, there is a cultural context which has now been established. The meat traders, for instance, would have known that this is something. So you can try to make a case for why that kind of a ban in those circumstances would be okay. To just suddenly start allowing this in Delhi or in other cities where this has never taken place before wouldn't necessarily get that protection from the Supreme Court, even if you were to point out this previous judgment, right? The Paryushan the order which was passed by the Supreme Court. The other one from the 2004 judgment, again, is a very important judgment, I think, because in that, Justice Dharmadhikari went into a great level of detail to look at why this Rishikesh meat ban, for instance, would be okay. And he pointed out that this had been something there had been bans on meat in various parts of the city since the 1950s. Like, it had been something which was such a long-standing kind of point that therefore there were grounds to say that this was something which was possible. There was a unique cultural context within the three-city area which the ban was to take place, which was considered by the courts. And on that basis, a ban on meat was justified. But in cities where that's not the case, where there is a high consumption of meat, something like Delhi, where it is a huge consumption of meat, especially in South Delhi, in East Delhi, no matter what these people with their Brahminical ideas of Hindu vegetarianism want to point out. So it's one of those situations where you can see why this really shouldn't work. There is no reason in law how this can happen. Yes, you can have reasonable restrictions on the right to on the right to even practice one's trade and profession. Yes, you can have reasonable restrictions even on the right to expression, which could include your choice of what you want to read, even on your right to personal life and liberty, which is your freedom of choice. There can be reasonable restrictions in these, but are these really reasonable restrictions? And if we apply the standards set down by the Supreme Court in the Puttaswamy judgment, where they've clearly acknowledged that you have to look at issues of proportionality before you're going to allow this, when you're looking at the legality of any kind of provision which restricts a person's fundamental rights, there's no basis for that to be the case here. I mean, if anything, you can say, yes, ensure there's hygiene. Yes, there's nothing dumped outside a temple. Sure, you can put these kind of things. And nothing should be dumped outside a person's house where they're observing this kind of thing. These kind of things are perfectly valid and reasonable restrictions to put. But to just have a complete closure, that makes no sense whatsoever, because you are restricting the fundamental rights of people who eat meat. You are restricting the rights of people who are involved in the trade, when there are far less restrictive measures, far less invasive measures which can be used for these things. So on that basis, clearly, I think, post 2017 at least, this kind of order can no longer be considered, would no longer, of course, since the order has not yet been passed, no such order would be legal in pretty much any cities. If you've got a specific city where there is some well-established cultural context or tradition of not having meat during this time or during a particular period of time, then perhaps a ban would work there. But in your average city or your average town or your average village, that absolutely cannot work. And one can only hope that if this is taken up with the courts, they will nip this in the bud before this becomes, again, one of those things which just starts to spread across multiple cities and then becomes a tool of intimidation and harassment, even where the order is not quite legal.
Despite the lack of such an official order, such an erratic ban has instilled a fear among Delhi's meat sellers. For more updates on this story, head over to the Quint's website, and of course do follow us on our social media handles. And if you're not already, subscribe to the Big Story podcast. If you like listening to this episode, please subscribe to the Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.